Welcome to the deep dive. Let me start with something a little counterintuitive.
Okay.
You've probably heard the saying, anything worth doing is worth doing well. Feels like common sense, right?
Yeah. Seems obvious.
Well, what if I told you most economists actually think that saying makes almost no sense at all?
Huh. That sounds strange. Unless you understand the economic thinking behind it, maybe.
Exactly. And here's another one for you. What on earth could sawdust possibly have to do with the price of milk?
Sawdust and milk. Okay, now you've got me curious.
Turns out there's a very real economic connection there, too.
There absolutely is. And getting that connection is really a peek into how economists see resource allocation.
Fascinating stuff. So today we're taking a deep dive into the distinct perspective, a foundational way economists view the world.
Right.
Our source material gives us a really comprehensive look through Stephen E. Rhodes' insightful book, The Economist's View of the World.
Yeah, it's a great source for this. We're going to unpack some, fundamental economic concepts that are really core to this viewpoint.
Like what?
Ideas like opportunity cost, marginalism, and the really powerful role of incentives.
Okay.
And we'll explore how economists apply these principles to analyze, well, huge policy questions, how markets work, government behavior, even things like individual choices and well-being.
So our mission today is to really get inside this way of thinking. It's pretty influential.
Definitely.
We want to see its powerful insights for understanding policy, maybe even your own daily decisions, but also look critically at where its limits might be.
Right, the blind spots.
The goal is for you to come away with a much clearer picture of how this discipline shapes so much of the world around us. Okay, let's unpack this.
Sounds good. So right at the heart, the absolute core of the Economist toolkit is this concept of opportunity cost.
Opportunity cost.
And it's much broader than just, the cash you hand over for something.
Right.
It's fundamentally about the value of the next best alternative that you give up whenever you make a choice.
Okay, so it's not just the money. Like if I spend an evening watching a movie,
Yeah.
the opportunity cost isn't just the ticket price. It's also the value of, say, reading that book I wanted to finish.
Exactly. Or maybe spending time with a friend, or even working an extra hour.
Okay. It's the value of the opportunity you let go of.
Precisely. And that's often where economists diverge a bit from other fields.
How so?
Well, think about an engineer looking at a proposed bridge project. They'll focus intensely on the concrete, the steel, the labor costs.
The cost of building that bridge.
Right. But the economist sort of steps back and asks a different question.
Like is
building this bridge the very best possible use of those resources compared to everything else we could do with them?
like upgrading schools, maybe? Or medical research.
Or even just a different infrastructure project altogether. They're always asking, compared to what?
Compared to what? Okay.
And the source gives some really clear examples of this, like the discussions around high-speed rail proposals.
Oh, yeah, I remember those. President Obama, then Joe Biden talking about them.
Right. But when a Brookings economist, Clifford Winston, looked at it through that economic lens, that opportunity cost lens, he found that even if you account for potential benefits like less congestion or lower emissions, a national network just couldn't be economically justified. The opportunity cost was too high.
And the real world costs certainly seem to back that up sometimes. That California project, right?
Yeah.
LA to San Francisco.
Exactly. The cost just ballooned. Started at maybe $33 billion.
Yeah.
And ended up projected somewhere between, $77 billion and nearly $100 billion.
Wow. And you started hearing politicians call it a rat hole, a sinkhole.
An abyss. Yeah. And that massive cost isn't just a number. It represents, decades of other things California could have done with that money, foregone opportunities.
It's a pretty stark illustration of why thinking about opportunity cost before committing huge resources is so important.
Absolutely vital.
And this isn't just for giant projects, is it? The source also kind of pushes back on some of the hype around general infrastructure needs.
It does. You hear these big numbers thrown around.
Like President Obama talking about 70,000 structurally deficient bridges, or candidate Trump saying 61% of our bridges are in danger.
Right. And the source kind of says, hold on, while repairs are definitely needed, that level of hype is maybe way over the top when you look at it dispassionately.
So the reality, while needing investment, doesn't always match the political rhetoric.
That's the argument. And this opportunity cost lens also forces economists to view safety in a particular way.
How so?
Not as some absolute value that you maximize no matter what, but as something that inevitably involves trade-offs.
That feels intuitively uncomfortable for a lot of people, I think.
It does.
I can imagine a juror in a safety lawsuit thinking, they didn't make this car as safe as they possibly could have, a zero-risk mentality.
Right. And the source points out that while that feeling is understandable, policymakers actually make these risk-cost trade-offs constantly.
Even if they don't say it out loud.
Exactly. Implicitly or explicitly. Like
Wow.
diverting highway funds to non-safety things like bike trails or landscaping
That.
means that money isn't going to crash barriers or road improvements that could have saved lives somewhere else. It's a tough opportunity cost.
It really is. And it gets even starker with things like energy choices.
Yeah, the source contrasts say the estimated annual cancer deaths from coal plants with a single big event like Chernobyl.
Okay.
Or it cites physicists Wilson and Crouch comparing cancer risks over 5 years. Living near a normally operating nuclear plant. Far less risk than getting chest x-rays or even just the extra cosmic radiation living in Denver.
That really puts the risks and benefits of different energy sources in a different light, thinking about lives saved or lost as the opportunity cost.
It does. And this focus on trade-offs, well, it often puts economists at odds with some natural scientists and environmental groups. The source notes that groups supporting something like the Endangered Species Act often resist discussing the economic costs or the benefits you give up from development that's halted.
So they prioritize the species or environment? Almost absolutely.
The source characterizes it as sometimes involving no thinking about opportunity costs or benefits foregone elsewhere.
They don't quantify or maybe even acknowledge what society is giving up in other areas.
That's the critique. The source uses an older example, the Tox Island Dam proposal.
Okay.
Critics focused on sort of abstract values, the free-flowing river, maybe a traditional family picnic spot, what the source calls groping upwards in valuation.
Right. Intangibles.
But the dam's proponents pointed to concrete, quantifiable recreational benefits. A huge park, a big lake, beaches, nature walks, capacity for thousands of visitors.
Showing very different ways of valuing the outcomes.
Exactly. And the picture looks totally different depending on what values you emphasize and which ones you, well, ignore.
Okay, that makes sense. Opportunity cost is about the alternatives. So how does that connect to marginalism? That was the other core idea.
Right, marginalism. It's closely related because it's about where you apply that opportunity cost thinking.
Okay.
It's the idea that most decisions aren't all or nothing. They're made at the margin.
At the margin.
Yeah, focusing on the cost and benefit of just one more unit of something,
Right.
one more hour studied, one more dollar invested, one more slice of pizza.
Okay. So this brings us back to that opening hook about anything worth doing is worth doing well. Is marginalism why economists disagree?
Precisely. The source quotes James Buchanan, a Nobel laureate, saying this disagreement is a key way to spot an economist.
Really?
Yeah, and a poll mentioned found like 74% of economists disagree with that saying. McKenzie and Tulloch even titled a book chapter, Anything Worth Doing is Not Necessarily Worth Doing Well.
Okay. Okay, I think I get it now.
Yeah.
Spending infinite time or money to make something perfect means you're giving up the chance to use those resources on something else where they might give you a better return at the margin.
Exactly. It's about optimizing your effort, your resources, not achieving perfection everywhere. You put the next bit of effort where the marginal return is highest.
How does that apply to public policy?
Well, the source discusses this argument about, say, early deaths among young people from accidents or suicides being the biggest problem.
Right, in terms of years of life lost, maybe.
But a marginalist economist asks, where can we spend one additional dollar or one additional hour of effort right now to save the most lives? So if preventing those specific deaths is super costly at the margin, but maybe a medical breakthrough makes treating, say, the sixth leading cause of death suddenly really cheap and effective.
Then the marginal analysis says, put the next dollar there.
But potentially, yes. Even if it's not the single biggest problem overall in terms of total numbers, you look at where the next intervention yields the most benefit for the cost.
So always looking at the next increment, comparing the costs and benefits of that specific step across different options.
That's the core idea. And the source notes how public preferences, like in polls, can clash with this.
Like the Proposition 13 example in California.
Yeah. Voters strongly opposed cutting police or fire budgets, but they probably weren't thinking about marginal efficiencies.
Like using civilian clerks for desk work.
Yeah.
Or more reservists.
Exactly. Things that could save resources at the margin without necessarily impacting core services in the way people feared. Polls capture general feelings. Marginal analysis looks at specific tweaks.
And that FAA example you mentioned earlier sounds like a classic case of not thinking marginally.
Oh, absolutely. The source describes them setting separate goals: reduce accidents by X%, reduce delays by Y%, noise by Z%.
Okay.
But they set these goals kind of in isolation without weighing the marginal gains and costs of pursuing one versus the others.
You can't do everything at once.
Right. The source says, we can know how high to set any one objective only if we know what we give up in progress toward other objectives. That's marginal thinking in a nutshell. You optimize allocation at the margin.
Got it. Opportunity cost is the alternative value. Marginalism is applying that to the next unit. Now let's talk incentives. This feels like another area where economists have a really distinct view.
They really do. Economists put immense faith in the power of incentives, using private interests, basically, to achieve public goals.
Charles Schultz's work, The Public Use of Private Interest.
That's the one. It's influential.
So instead of just telling people or companies exactly what to do, you set up a system where their own self-interest leads them to do what society or the policymaker wants.
Precisely. Think about the contrast with traditional command and control environmental regulation.
Like the EPA, setting rigid pollution standards or mandating specific technologies.
Exactly. The source points out the weaknesses there. Deadlines get ignored. The EPA often doesn't have the detailed industry knowledge. There's that famous quote from Senator Muskie basically telling auto execs, you guys have got to figure this out yourselves, because the regulators just didn't know the best way.
So command and control can be clunky and inefficient.
Often, yeah. Incentive-based approaches like pollution taxes.
Making firms pay per unit of pollution.
Right. Or cap-and-trade systems like selling licenses to pollute that can be traded. These tend to work differently.
How are they more effective?
Well, the source explains it clearly. Firms that can cut pollution cheaply have a strong incentive to do it, either to avoid the tax or to sell their permits.
Ah, so the cheapest reductions happen first, across the whole economy.
Exactly. It also makes products that cause more pollution naturally more expensive for consumers.
And crucially, it creates an ongoing incentive for innovation, doesn't it?
Yes, that's key. Under command and control, once you meet the standard, why do more? With a tax or tradable permit, you always have an incentive to find cheaper ways to pollute less, so you pay less tax or can sell more permits. The source argues these taxes will cut pollution. They won't just be paid as a cost of business.
And the sulfur dioxide trading program is mentioned as a real-world success.
Yeah, where firms that found it really expensive to cut SO2 just bought allowances from firms that could do it cheaply instead of fighting the regulation itself.
Makes sense. And it's not just profit-seeking firms, right?
Yeah.
The principle applies more broadly.
Absolutely. The basic idea that demand changes with price applies everywhere. Public services, too.
Like congestion pricing for roads, that old chestnut.
It's a classic example in the source, yeah. Most congested roads aren't priced by demand, so you get jams.
And just building more public transport doesn't always solve it.
Not entirely, because people still choose to drive if their private cost, just their time stuck in traffic, is less than the total societal cost, which includes delaying everyone else.
So pricing the road forces drivers to face a cost closer to the real societal cost.
Exactly. It incentivizes shifting travel times, carpooling, using alternatives,
Right.
things that reduce the overall burden.
Makes economic sense, even if it's politically tricky sometimes.
Very tricky.
And the National Flood Insurance Program example seems like another case of incentives gone wrong.
It does. The source argues it acts like a safety net for risky coastal development.
Subsidized by average taxpayers, often benefiting wealthier property owners.
That's the claim. It shields people from the true risk cost.
Tell me about that Scottsville, Virginia case study again. That sounded really illustrative.
It really was. Businesses had apparently left Scottsville because of constant flooding.
Okay.
But once they put in some flood prevention measures that allowed federal flood insurance to be offered, businesses started coming back.
Huh.
And a local owner is quoted saying something like, anybody in their right mind wouldn't want to build in the floodplain.
Yet the insurance program, by lowering the perceived risk cost,
Effectively incentivized building and rebuilding in these dangerous areas, pushing the ultimate risk onto taxpayers.
So maybe good intentions, but the incentive structure creates potentially inefficient and risky outcomes.
That's the core of the Economist critique there. Okay, so moving to a slightly broader view, this brings us to how economists think about government versus markets and these big ideas of efficiency and equity.
Okay. Welfare economics.
Right. That's the branch concerned with society's well-being, and it looks at anything people value, not just money, but clean air, education, aesthetics.
But it has a key limitation, you said.
Yes, it fundamentally cannot make interpersonal comparisons of satisfaction or utility. You can't scientifically say, my enjoyment of X is greater than your enjoyment of Y.
Can't add up happiness units. Okay. What about Pareto optimality?
That's another concept. A situation is Pareto optimal if you can't make anyone better off without making someone else worse off.
And a Pareto improvement.
Is a change that helps at least one person and hurts nobody. But the source points out it's a really strict criterion.
Hard to achieve in the real world.
Very rare for any significant policy change, so it's of limited practical use for guiding policy.
Okay, so if those broad evaluation tools are limited, what do economists see as the main driver of efficiency in society?
Markets. Overwhelmingly, economists see markets as incredibly powerful mechanisms for efficiency.
Why?
Firms have this built-in incentive to respond to what consumers want and to use resources efficiently. If they don't, competitors will eat their lunch.
So consumer dollar votes direct resources.
Effectively, yes. And the prices, the costs within the market, reflect the competing uses for those resources elsewhere in the economy. It's innovate or lose out.
But economists do acknowledge markets aren't perfect, right? Market failures.
Oh, absolutely. That's crucial. Market failures can justify government intervention. Public goods are a classic case.
Like national defense.
Yeah.
Or streetlights.
Exactly. Things where it's hard to stop people from benefiting once it's provided, even if they don't pay.
A free rider problem.
Right. So consumers won't reveal their true willingness to pay, and the market tends to underprovide these goods. Government steps in, ideally only providing them if the collective willingness to pay is greater than the opportunity cost.
Which cost-benefit analysis tries to figure out.
Tries to, yes. And the other big market failure is externalities, or spillovers, which we touched on.
Effects on third parties not in the price. Like pollution.
Pollution is the classic negative one. Your neighbor painting their house, boosting curb appeal, that's a positive one.
Okay.
The market tends to underprovide things with positive externalities because the provider doesn't capture all the benefits.
And overprovide things with negative ones, like pollution.
Because the firm doesn't bear the full cost. A pollution tax aims to make the firm internalize that external cost.
So market failures can justify government action. But the economic view is also really focused on the potential for government failure, too.
Yes, very much so. The idea that governments might also fail to allocate resources efficiently.
How can government fail?
Well, democratic failure? Maybe. Like in a town meeting, a simple majority might vote for a project, even if the total value to the supporters is less than the cost. Especially if a minority intensely dislikes it and would pay more to stop it.
Okay. And bureaucratic failure seems almost baked in sometimes.
Economists often argue that government bureaus, especially if they have a monopoly, might focus on maximizing their budget or power, not necessarily efficiency.
And politicians?
Elected representatives often lack the super detailed information needed to push for efficiency deep inside agencies. And they might be more incentivized to back programs with really visible, immediate benefits for their constituents.
Even if the costs are hidden or spread out.
Exactly, even if the long-term economics aren't great.
The source had some pretty striking examples here, like contracting out government services saving money.
Yes, definitely. It cites studies showing significant savings, like 30% on average for federal services contracted out.
Yeah.
Things like custodial work, maintenance, security.
And local examples, too. Trash collection, firefighting.
Yeah, studies show savings there too, sometimes substantial. But despite this evidence, it's not super widespread.
Why not?
Well, the source notes only about 27% of cities contract out the average service. Economists might point to bureaucratic inertia, political opposition from public employee unions, things like that.
And then there are the classic examples of, well, wasteful projects. Amtrak subsidies outside the Northeast.
Right. The source argues those subsidies are less efficient than cars or buses for energy use. Don't do much for congestion or pollution, but they persist.
And the subsidy helps everyone on the train, not just targeted groups who might need help.
Exactly. Or think about those big Bureau of Reclamation water projects out west. Often the costs massively exceed the benefits, yet they provide water to farmers at like 10% of its market value.
Which encourages overuse of scarce water.
Right. And these projects often get pushed through because politicians want to bring federal money and visible projects to their state or district, kind of regardless of the overall economics.
And those government debt collection failures just sound maddeningly inefficient.
They're frustrating examples. The source mentions FERC refusing negative bidding.
Where a private company would pay the government to take over collecting debts.
Yeah, because the money collected would go to the Treasury, not FERC's budget, and it was seen as burdensome to administer.
Wow.
Or the Department of Defense failing to get refunds on $100 million in unused airline tickets, and even paying again for tickets it had already bought.
Unbelievable.
And the IRS abandoning billions in unpaid taxes, with a deputy Treasury secretary even suggesting private collection might be more effective. These are all cited as examples where government systems or incentives just don't prioritize basic financial common sense.
These really build the case for why economists are often skeptical about government efficiency. And this ties into privatization, which the source says grew after 1980.
Yes. Cities like New York under Giuliani, Indianapolis under Goldsmith, they really embraced contracting out services, based on that idea that private firms facing market competition would just be more efficient.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. Industrial policy. This is where the government tries to pick winners, right? Support specific industries or firms.
Exactly. And this is an area where you see remarkable consensus among economists, even those on the center-left, expressing strong skepticism.
Really, even liberal economists.
Yeah, the source names people like Paul Samuelson, Alfred Kahn, Charles Schultz, Larry Summers, all prominent Democratic economists strongly opposing industrial policy. Summers famously called the government a crappy venture capitalist.
Why such strong opposition, even from those who support other kinds of government action?
The main worry is that it just becomes a vehicle for powerful businesses and labor unions to lobby for protection, subsidies, maybe even help forming cartels. It distorts the market instead of fixing a failure.
Okay.
And they also argue the U.S. economy is generally pretty dynamic. It can transition from old to new industries through private innovation and entrepreneurship without needing the government to try and steer the whole process.
And the theoretical reason they think government steering fails?
Well, private innovation is just inherently unpredictable, wildly unpredictable. The market, they argue, is much better at quickly recognizing and abandoning bad bets.
Failing fast.
Right, and finding the most promising paths for good ideas. Government, on the other hand, often feels pressure to keep supporting projects or industries even when they aren't panning out economically.
What about things like enterprise zones or opportunity zones? Tax breaks in poorer areas. That seems different from picking specific industries.
It is different, and economists tend to view those a bit more favorably because the incentive applies more broadly.
But do they work?
Well, studies on earlier enterprise zones, according to the source, found they were largely ineffective at actually boosting employment significantly. The source mentions the Trump administration's opportunity zones with potentially bigger tax incentives, but says it was really too early to judge their results when the source material was compiled.
And those government loan failures, Solyndra, Fisker, Synfuels, they seem to support that crappy venture capitalist view pretty strongly.
They certainly get cited that way. The source mentions them, along with interventions like the Bush administration's steel tariffs, as examples where government attempts to direct or protect specific economic sectors often led to poor results compared to letting market forces work.
Okay, let's pivot now to a really sensitive topic. Equity, the distribution of income and wealth. Economists often say they don't have special expertise on the value question, right? Like, what's fair?
That's generally the stance. They try to stay out of the purely philosophical debate about what distributions should look like, but they can analyze the economic efficiency aspects of redistribution.
How can taking from one group and giving to another possibly be framed as efficient? That sounds odd.
Well, the argument, as presented in the source, goes like this. Reducing poverty or maybe extreme inequality can be seen as a public good, something society collectively values.
Okay, a public good like clean air.
Sort of, but private charity might underprovide this public good because of the free rider problem. I might want less poverty around me, but I hope you donate so I don't have to. So government coercion, through taxes, can make everyone contribute their fair share towards this public good of poverty reduction. And if the collective willingness to pay for that reduction via taxes is greater than the costs.
Including the costs of taxes possibly reducing work effort or investment.
Right. If the benefits outweigh those costs, then the redistribution can be viewed as economically efficient. Even potentially Pareto optimal in a specific sense, if you accept compelling contribution to a public good is valid.
That's a very particular economic framing. What about the actual facts on distribution the source mentions?
It cites studies finding that economic mobility, your chances of moving up or down the income ladder, has been roughly stable in the U.S. for the last half century or so,
Stable.
though notably lower than in places like Canada or Western Europe. The odds of escaping poverty are cited as maybe twice as high in Denmark, for instance.
But mobility at the top has changed.
Yeah, mobility at the very top seems to have increased. More entrepreneurs, fewer inheritors on lists like the Forbes 400 over time.
And the debate over why poverty has reduced.
Conservatives tend to credit economic growth and maybe welfare reforms that added work requirements. The source acknowledges those factors, but also emphasizes that a large part of the dramatic poverty reduction, especially for certain groups, comes directly from government transfer programs, not just people becoming more self-sufficient through work alone.
Geographic immobility comes up too, people not moving for jobs.
Yes, some economists see that as a big issue. Workers in struggling areas being unwilling or unable to move to cities with more opportunity, which holds back their income potential. Even lower-wage jobs often pay more in booming cities.
And that's leading to renewed interest in place-based policies, helping poor places, not just poor people.
It is a bit of a shift. Traditionally, economists preferred giving support directly to people, letting them choose where to live.
But now there's more interest in helping specific regions.
There is, but the source notes still not a lot of enthusiasm among economists for the specific ideas proposed so far. Studies haven't shown, for instance, that place-based incentives strongly draw non-working poor men back into the labor force.
What about comparing the U.S. to, say, France? The source argues France isn't necessarily a better model.
The argument presented is that U.S. income per capita is significantly higher, maybe 30% higher.
Why?
And it's attributed largely to Americans simply working more hours, which in turn might be linked to lower marginal tax rates in the U.S., providing a stronger incentive to work those extra hours.
So maybe less equality in the U.S., but higher overall income, potentially higher reward for additional effort. What about the different philosophical takes on equity itself?
Well, there's the utilitarian view, which is pretty common among economists.
Utilitarian.
Yeah, basically focused on maximizing overall societal well-being or efficiency. This often leads to thinking about taxation based on how much revenue you can raise for transfers without significantly hurting incentives to work or invest. It's about balancing the benefits of redistribution against the efficiency costs.
Okay. And the other view, just deserts.
Right. That's associated with economists like Greg Mankiw, the idea that income should primarily reflect what people deserve based on their contribution, their effort, their talent.
But doesn't success also depend on public goods, like roads and schools, paid for by everyone?
That's the counter-argument the source mentions. But someone like Mankiw might say, yes, infrastructure helps, but the person with the brilliant idea, who takes the risk, does the work, gets the investors they deserve, the wealth created by that specific contribution.
It's a fundamental difference in perspective. The wealth tax debate seems to touch on these issues too. Senator Warren's proposal.
Yeah, an annual tax on wealth over $50 million. The source discusses counter-arguments like Larry Summers suggesting the administrative and compliance costs would be huge. Wealth can be hidden, put in complex legal structures offshore.
Hard to track and tax effectively.
That's the concern. The source notes most economists tend to prefer sticking to progressive income, gift, and estate taxes to raise revenue, seeing them as potentially less costly and distortionary.
And the source had some interesting points about how the super rich actually spend their money, kind of pushing back on stereotypes.
It did. It argues much of their spending isn't just lavish consumption, but actually goes into useful things, investments, starting companies, funding innovation.
Like using wealth as a tool.
Exactly. It cites a book, The $1 Billion Secret. Find many billionaires enjoy the process of making money more than spending it, often live relatively frugally, and see wealth mainly for investment and creation.
And CEOs working longer hours.
Yeah. It notes CEOs, often criticized for high pay, also tend to work significantly longer hours than the average worker.
Okay. What about minimum wage? Another hot topic.
Huge debate there. The source notes the main focus is often job losses versus wage gains for those at the bottom.
And the evidence is mixed.
It acknowledges some studies show job losses, others suggest maybe they're offset by gains just above the new minimum. It's contested.
But the source also mentions other, less discussed effects.
Yes, really interesting ones, citing studies linking, say, a 10% minimum wage rise to a 3.6% reduction in suicides among less educated adults,
Wow.
or a 50-cent rise potentially reducing the chance of former prisoners returning to prison by nearly 3%. These are sort of hidden positive externalities that aren't usually part of the main jobs debate.
Fascinating. And housing subsidies. The source critiques the traditional approach.
Yes, it's critical of project-based subsidies like public housing or Section 8 certificates tied to specific buildings.
Why? What are the problems?
Things like high administrative costs, burdens on landlords, potential for housing discrimination, and crucially, lack of tenant choice, which can end up concentrating poverty.
So what's the preferred alternative?
Housing vouchers, Section 8 portable vouchers, are generally favored by economists. They give tenants money they can use to rent housing on the private market.
More choice for the tenant.
Exactly. More choice, potentially reducing segregation if they can move to better neighborhoods. It's seen as more efficient. But, the source notes, vouchers face political resistance, partly from developers and others who benefit from the project-based system.
Okay, let's just briefly loop back to externalities again, because the source really hammers home how common they are.
Everywhere, basically. They can theoretically justify government intervention all over the place.
Positive ones like flu shots helping protect others,
Or your neighbor's nicely painted house improving the look of the street.
and negative ones like pollution or even just loud radios in public.
Right. And the key point is because the full benefits or costs aren't captured by the person making the decision.
The market outcome isn't necessarily optimal.
Exactly. The market won't automatically provide the right amount of flu shots or the right amount of quiet.
And for negative ones like pollution, just asking companies nicely won't work.
Generally not, the source reinforces. Volunteerism fails because the costs of cutting pollution are internal to the firm, but the benefits of cleaner air are external, spread out among everyone else.
The auto emissions story seems to show how a mandate can force change when incentives or volunteerism don't cut it.
That's a great example from the source. Auto companies initially claimed controlling emissions was too hard or costly. But then California passed a law in 1963 saying control systems would be required 1 year after 2 certified systems became available.
Creating a clear market incentive.
Exactly. It spurred equipment manufacturers to innovate, and automakers had to adopt the tech. Result: required devices on 1966 models. Government action overcame the externality and forced the change.
So how do economists evaluate these interventions? Cost-benefit analysis or CBA?
That's the main tool, trying to weigh the collective willingness to pay for a public good against its opportunity cost, or seeing if the benefits of a regulation, like cleaner air from power plant rules, outweigh the costs to industry and consumers.
Ignoring costs would be unreasonable.
From an economic perspective, yes. The source stresses that. It also mentions the Trump administration pushing for retrospective CBA, looking back at old regulations to see if they're still worth the cost.
Interestingly, the source also says economists sometimes preferred information approaches over mandates to preserve choice.
Historically, yes. The idea being give consumers good information and they can make choices that align with their own preferences about safety, energy efficiency, whatever.
And there's evidence this works, like Energy Star labels.
Yeah, evidence suggests labels like that do influence what people buy. The critique in the source is that government analysis often overlook these informational solutions when jumping to new mandates.
But the source is also skeptical of overly complex disclosure laws.
Very skeptical. It really questions whether those super long, complicated disclosure statements you get from banks or detailed food ingredient lists are actually useful.
Or just information overload.
Exactly. That example of a bank offering $10 if customers mention Regulation E from a disclosure.
And 0 takers out of 115,000.
Yeah, that's pretty telling. Just throwing information out there isn't helpful if people can't understand it or put it in context. Like, is 5 parts per million of something bad? Who knows?
Okay, so economists have these powerful analytical tools for systems and policies. But what about, individual well-being? Happiness. How does economics handle that?
Well, the basic standard economic approach often just assumes that consumer preferences, revealed by what they're willing to pay for things, are the key measure of value and well-being. Get people what they want.
But the source points out, sometimes our actions don't seem to line up with maybe our deeper preferences, like smoking or overspending.
That's a really crucial nuance the source gets into. That poll asking smokers if they'd prefer a cigarette tax hike over an income tax hike.
Yeah, that was surprising. Many preferred the cigarette tax.
30 out of 50 did, and some explicitly said it would help them quit or cut down things they wanted to do anyway but found hard.
Saying things like, it's a habit I can do without, or
Hmm.
it's my fault, I might stop.
Exactly. It shows this internal conflict. And the source adds that when smoking bans came to bars and restaurants, some smokers who quit actually reported being happier afterwards. The policy helped them achieve a goal they struggled with.
And overspending. That shift from installment plans being maybe shameful to finance companies actively advertising loans for vacations, you deserve it.
Yeah, the source presents that as another case where maybe immediate gratification gets incentivized, potentially undermining longer-term financial health or deeper goals.
There's even an evolutionary psychology angle mentioned.
Right, suggesting maybe some of our ingrained behaviors were suited for a hunter-gatherer past the, maybe not having a strong instinct to save for retirement decades away when lifespans were short and aren't perfectly adapted for today's world.
Economists traditionally try to avoid judging preferences, though, right? Just take tastes as they find them.
They do try, but the source argues this can lead to some uncomfortable or ethically tricky conclusions.
Like what?
Like in a purely technical cost-benefit analysis, should gains to criminals from committing crime count positively, just like gains from legal activity? Should the costs imposed on someone with hateful views by saving the life of someone they dislike count negatively? The value-neutral stance bumps up against moral intuition there.
And it contrasts with other philosophical views, like Mill distinguishing higher versus lower pleasures.
Exactly. Mill argued some forms of happiness or well-being are inherently better or more valuable than others. Economics traditionally avoids making those kinds of judgments.
What about the link between happiness and income? That's a big one.
It's complex. The source notes studies finding that big increases in real income over decades haven't always led to similar increases in reported happiness.
Why not?
Well, Robert Frank's argument, mentioned in the source, is that relative income and status matter more than absolute income. How you're doing compared to your neighbors or peers might impact your happiness more than just your raw income level.
He suggests Darwin might be the real founder of economics,
Wow.
because status seeking is so fundamental.
It's his provocative line, yeah. Implying this drive for relative position is deep-seated.
But surely absolute income matters too. You need a certain amount to live comfortably.
Oh, absolutely. Other studies show absolute income definitely matters, especially for people starting from low levels. And the source has that great thought experiment.
The student from the 1940s seeing a modern apartment.
Yeah. Central heating, air conditioning, endless food, entertainment, things we take for granted now. We habituate, but they represent huge absolute gains in well-being compared to the past. So absolute income does matter, even if the happiness link isn't always linear at the top.
And advertising probably pushes us towards material things.
The source suggests that, yeah, the constant incentives from profit seekers are to buy more stuff, potentially drowning out non-material sources of happiness, like relationships, learning, community involvement.
And it reminds us that older economists actually did think about this broader stuff.
Yes, people like Adam Smith, Alfred Marshall, they considered character, virtue, intellectual development as really important parts of a good life, not just maximizing utility from buying things.
Smith worried about factory work making people stupid and ignorant.
He did. He worried it could diminish their capacity for rational conversation, judgment, and finer sentiments, a much broader concern than just wages.
So the scope of economics used to be wider, it sounds like.
It seems so. And the source points to fields like positive psychology today, studying things like awe, gratitude, elevation, feelings modern economics doesn't really have categories for.
Jonathan Haidt's experiment. Seeing kindness versus achieving a goal.
Right. Showing different physical and motivational responses, suggesting different pathways to well-being that aren't just about satisfying personal preferences.
Why does the source think modern economics overlooks these things?
It suggests the discipline became more technical, more mathematical, more insular, focused heavily on recent economic research, maybe less on the history of thought or insights from other fields like psychology or philosophy.
And that focus on only what's empirically verifiable
Can lead to dismissing things that are harder to measure, like virtue or meaning, even if they're crucial to human experience.
Okay, this leads us nicely into the limits of the economic view, especially when it comes to politics and deliberation. Economists often seem to assume policy should just be about adding up individual preferences.
That's often the implicit model, yeah.
Did I-
Figure out what people want, how much they want it, willingness to pay, and then design policies to deliver that efficiently. It assumes people have clear, stable preferences.
But is that realistic? especially in politics. Are citizens really that well informed?
Well, the source tackles this head-on, citing Brian Kaplan's rational ignorance idea.
Rational ignorance.
Yeah. For any single voter, the chance their vote actually decides an election is tiny, right?
Vanishingly small, usually.
So it's actually rational for that voter not to invest huge amounts of time becoming an expert on complex policy issues. The payoff is too small.
And polls show this. People aren't experts.
Consistently, polls show widespread ignorance on basic economic facts, and people often hold contradictory views like wanting deficit reduction but opposing cuts to almost every specific spending program.
So using direct democracy, like ballot initiatives, might actually make this worse.
The source argues it can. Public choice economists sometimes like initiatives because they simplify choices, but the individual vote still doesn't matter much, so the rational ignorance remains. And you can get poorly thought out, complex measures passed with unintended consequences.
Like some issues with Proposition 13 in California are mentioned.
Right. Even when proponents suggest involving the legislature later, it's often in a limited way.
How does representative democracy fit in? Isn't that supposed to help?
Historically, yes. People like James Madison saw representatives as filters, people who could become informed, deliberate, and refine public opinion.
Representatives can specialize, study issues in committees.
Exactly. And ideally, be influenced by facts and reasoned argument. The source even notes that most lobbying isn't shady deals, it's providing information and analysis 99%, not involving parties, and passing plain white envelopes.
And there are examples of genuine deliberation happening.
Yes, the source gives examples. A California committee chair on budget deliberation, Representative Bob Gidlott's approach to immigration law, Paul Ryan getting advice from Barney Frank about focusing on policy substance.
So the potential for informed deliberation is there in the system.
It is. But the source also acknowledges the reality. Representatives are also driven hard by re-election incentives.
Which pushes them towards policies with visible benefits and hidden costs. Things easy to sell back home.
Often, yes. That political reality clashes with the deliberative ideal.
And economists' typical focus on self-interest might miss other important motivations in politics.
That's a major critique in the source. Economists often default to assuming self-interest drives everything, sometimes narrowly defining it as financial self-interest.
Leading to weird conclusions, like taxpayers gaining when Social Security recipients die early.
Exactly. It seems callous because it ignores the human element. The source argues economists tend to overlook non-material motives. Duty, fairness, public spirit, ethics, goodwill, civility, even when they are clearly present and important for society. The focus stays narrowly on channeling self-interest.
Okay, so let's try to wrap this all up. What are economists really, really good at, according to this view, and what's maybe missing?
Well, their core strength is understanding how markets work. They really grasp the powerful incentives that drive private firms to respond to demand, use resources efficiently, innovate.
And they argue government just doesn't have similarly powerful mechanisms for efficiency.
That's the core argument, yes. Government operates under different constraints and incentives.
And the evidence generally supports this view of comparative efficiency.
The source suggests there's considerable evidence backing the idea that markets, when they function well, are remarkably efficient compared to government direction. And it notes this is a judgment shared broadly by economists across the political spectrum, liberal and conservative.
The Robert Samuelson quote, "Government can set the climate, but otherwise, stand aside."
Pretty much sums up that view, yeah.
The source also claims the public is often hostile to markets, just out of ignorance.
It argues that yes, that people don't fully grasp how markets coordinate complex activity until they study it systematically, maybe even at the graduate level, that studying markets often increases respect for them.
Like updating Akerlof's famous market for lemons idea.
Exactly. Akerlof showed in 1970 how asymmetric information sellers knowing more than buyers about used cars could wreck a market.
Right.
But the source points out how the private sector itself developed solutions over time. Carfax, online vehicle histories, manufacturer info providing way more information than the government ever mandated, helping the market work much better.
And zooming way out, the long-term progress under capitalism.
That simple comparison the source uses is powerful. U.S. income per person adjusted for inflation going from maybe $3 a day in 1800 to $120 a day in 2010. Just immense progress in material well-being under market-based systems.
Okay, let's revisit happiness, inequality, mobility one last time. What's the conclusion there?
The source brings in Arthur Brooks, arguing people report being happier in countries with more mobility, more opportunity to rise, not just more static equality.
Interesting. Mobility over equality for happiness.
That's the argument presented, and it pieces that question. Would we really be better off if innovators like Gates or Bezos or Winfrey had been born in, say, Switzerland, with maybe less inequality but potentially less opportunity or incentive to build what they built?
Hmm. And that's reinforced by the Nordhaus finding about who captures the benefits of innovation.
Absolutely. That research by William Nordhaus finding innovators themselves only capture a tiny sliver, like 2.2% of the total welfare gains from their breakthroughs.
Consumers get almost all of it, 97.8%.
That's the finding. So the market system, despite inequality debates, seems incredibly effective at spreading the benefits of innovation very, very broadly.
So economists, powerful analysts of systems, incentives, trade-offs, especially markets. But the final critique is that modern economics has become too narrow, lost something.
That's the missing perspective the press
Mhm.
highlights, yeah. That it's become too technical, too insular, forgetting that economic man is not the total man.
And fields like positive psychology or virtue ethics might help bring back broader concerns.
The source suggests they offer potential paths to reconnect economics with those deeper questions about human character, motivation beyond simple utility, and overall well-being that figures like Smith and Marshall thought were absolutely central.
Well, we've certainly taken a deep dive today into this distinct economic way of thinking. We've explored opportunity cost, marginalism,
Uh-huh.
seen how incentives can apply to everything from pollution to flood insurance,
Right.
compared market efficiency and government efficiency, looked at equity, even happiness.
And we touched on why sawdust prices can matter. For milk, it's an input cost, affects agricultural resource allocation. We talked about the surprising economics of high-speed rail,
Why anything worth doing is not necessarily worth doing well.
the power of pollution taxes, why complex disclosures might be useless,
Why smokers might want higher cigarette taxes.
and how today's technical focus differs from the past's broader concerns.
Hopefully, this deep dive has given you, our listener, a new, maybe sharper lens to view policy debates, public discussions, maybe even your own choices about time and resources.
Yeah, understanding these core concepts really is essential for being an informed citizen in a democracy and navigating a market economy.
Definitely.
And here's something to maybe keep mulling over, building on that really striking Nordhaus finding.
Okay.
The source tells us innovators capture only that tiny fraction, 2.2%, of the huge benefits their innovations bring society. And it cites research suggesting mobility might matter more for happiness than simple equality. So, given that the market system seems incredibly good at delivering those vast welfare gains to consumers through innovation, how does your own sense of fairness square with that distribution? Does knowing innovators get just 2.2% of the pie they created change how you think about income inequality at the very top?
Something to think about next time you use a new app or benefit from a medical advance.